Said my family was a merchant in Osaka for 6 generations, but our family lost everything in March 1945 at the end of the war.
Yes.
So we lost everything. Everything was burned. My father left the city and went to countryside, and he wanted to be a farmer. And he started to live in the countryside, and that was where I was born. But because my parents had 5 children, it's really difficult to raise 5 children in that small place. So he returned to the city and worked for a small company. And when I became a teenager, when I had to think about my future, my father said, because we lost all the wealth, property, so I was free. In Japan, I was the oldest son. In Japanese culture, traditional culture, oldest son had a responsibility to take care of family wealth and business, and take care of the parents when they become aged. But he said, my father said, I was free because I have nothing to take care of. I had to think about what I should do. And at that time, that was middle of 60s. There are so many problems within Japan and in this world. And in Japan, after World War II, Japanese people worked so hard to restore prosperity after the war. They worked so hard to make money, and I didn't like that. In the 60s, Japan become rich country, and they started to build Shinkansen, the bullet train line, and highways between Tokyo and Osaka. I lived in the city in Osaka. And before that, when I was a child, I could swim in the river, I could, play in the rice field and woods. But swimming in the river was prohibited before I became a teenager because of that pollution. So that, to me, that kind of so-called progress or development is a destruction. So I didn't like that. And also because of that economy, Japanese school system was very competitive. So I was always asked from my parents and teachers to study hard, to go to a good school. And I didn't like competition. Around that time, I started to have a question why I have to study so hard at school, and why Japanese people had to work to make money. And that, to me, that is destruction of nature and traditional culture. That was the point. I think I was like about 15 or 16 years old, high school student. I started to read books about philosophy or novels or history, science, to understand why I have to live in this way. And the more I read books and thought, I had deeper question. What is the meaning of life? And I thought, unless we find the meaning of life, I cannot make any right decision to do in my future, for my future. I started to hate school life, studying in the school, to memorize everything and get a high mark for the examination and go to a prestigious university. I often escaped from classroom and read books in the library. And I wanted to know the meaning of life, meaning of what is happening in human society. My question become deeper and deeper, and I reached the point that I believe there's no meaning in human life, because meaning is something we create. Human life, human beings create, or in a sense produce or find. That is a kind of human reaction to the world. So, before human was appear in this world, there's no meaning. And to me, meaninglessness is more real. Meaning in human world is kind of a fiction. That is what I found. And I wanted to live being free from that kind of fictitious, human culture or civilization. Around the same time, a friend of mine, one of my classmates, had someone who practiced Zen in his family. And he stayed at a Zen temple in Kyoto. At that temple, Sawaki Kodo Roshi and Uchiyama Roshi lived and practiced with lay people. And that was 1965. In that year, my teacher Uchiyama Kosho Roshi published his first book. And when my friend came back from that temple, he allowed me to read that book. That was the first time I encountered Buddhist teaching, Buddhist or Zen teaching, and also my teacher's way of life. And when I read the book, somehow I wanted to become his disciple. That means I wanted to live like him. I was 17. 17. Mm-hmm. He described his journey of searching the meaning. So when he was a teenager, he had the same question I had. And he studied Western philosophy at university, undergraduate and graduate school, to find what is the truth or meaning of life. And finally he found what he was looking for in Zen practice, Zen teaching. And after that, he continued to practice and share what he found with younger generations. When I read spiritual books, I knew there are such, spiritual teachers in the human history, so many of them. But he was the first actual person who lived in that way. I think that was why I wanted to live like him. After that, I studied Buddhism and Zen teaching. And I went to Komadawa University. Before that, my friend who allowed me to read Uchiyama Roshi's book died next year with cancer. He was 17. He was my classroom, so he was 17. Because he was so young, the cancer grew so quickly. So he died within a year or so. Not only about my thinking or question about life, but he showed me actual life and death in front of me. When he died, I found there's no reason he had to die. Of course, there was cause he had to die, the cancer, but I didn't think there was no reason he had to die, and I didn't need to die. That means this may happen any time to me, and I couldn't complain. From his death, I studied that, our life may end any time, so I had no time to waste. So I should go straight to what I'm looking for instead of doing something meaningless. That's why I wanted to study Buddhism. So I went to Komadawa University. That was a Soto Zen Buddhist university. And Sawaki Roshi, my teacher's teacher, was a professor at the university for many years. So I knew that was the school I could study about what Uchiyama wrote. So I started to study Buddhism. I like studying Buddhism, but when I became a third grade of the university, I found that now I have to make a decision to become a Buddhist scholar or to be a monk or practitioner. And at that time, I felt, to study Buddhism through studying text and language. To be a Buddhist scholar, we have to study many languages, such as Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, Chinese, and we had to study 2 European languages. So my professor said, don't study Dogen, but first study language, then study the text. And I felt in order to study, and he also said, in order to become a real Buddhist scholar, I had to study, read books 10 hours a day for 10 years. And that was the starting point, not the goal. So I had to make a decision whether I want to go that way or directly practice. And I felt studying Buddhism through text is like or reading recipes without cooking and tasting. just read and compare which recipe is better than others. But I wanted to learn how to cook and taste, and if it's possible, to share the taste to other people. I felt, to become a Buddhist scholar is not my way to go. I was 21. I asked Uchiyama Roshi to be ordained, and he accepted. So I was ordained when I was 22, December 8th, 1970. But my father and my sister attended the ceremony, even though they are not happy about my becoming a Buddhist monk. That was how I started to walk this path. When I was 17 years old, I didn't like, Japanese economy, not only Japan, but at that time, there are so many problems in the world, Cold Wars and Vietnam Wars, and many American people, came to Asia to study Zen or Buddhism, and they became my friends. And they are looking for something alternative way of life from mass consumption, economy and politics. I found that was not my personal problem or a problem only in Japan, but Western people had the same problems. Most kind of attractive point of my teachers or Saki Roshi and Uchiyama Roshi's way of life is they don't care at all about money or economy, but for them to practice in poverty is important. Not only him, but in Buddhist tradition from Shakyamuni, poverty is a virtue. Poverty does not mean lack of wealth, but poverty means free from the greed, free from desire. Even though Shakyamuni was prince, he became a beggar. He gave up everything, and he walked on the street and shared what he awakened to with people in poverty. He received food from people, and that was the original Buddhist teaching. Uchiyama Roshi's life was almost the same. He lived in a small kind of a poor temple. In Japan, Buddhist temple has many family members and supported by those members. But the temple called Antaiji had no family members. That means no regular income. So Uchamoroshi had to support his practice by begging. Exactly same with Shakyamuni. So he did begging, in Japanese called takuhatsu, in the city of Kyoto. I was really attracted to live in that way of life. So when I became a monk and started practice at Antaiji, our practice was completely supported by begging. We didn't charge anything to the people who come to practice with us. That way of life, without thinking about income and possession, was really something attracted, me. During 5 years at Antaiji, I practiced in that way. So we had almost no personal possession at all. After 5 years, in 1975, Uchamoroshi, my teacher, retired. Before that, when I started to practice at Antaiji, there are many Westerners coming to practice with him, but he didn't speak any Western language. But he wanted to teach those Western people, so he asked his disciples to study English. And he asked almost all of his disciples, but only 3 of us said yes, and I was one of them. I was not really interested in studying English at all, but somehow I couldn't say no. He sent those 3 of us to English school in Osaka. So I started to study English. So when Uchamoroshi retired from Antaiji, he asked those 3 people to come to this country. And we bought a small piece of land in western Massachusetts. And we had nothing. We just cut the trees and built a small house, and we started to practice there. When I went there, none of us had even a driver's license. And also, we didn't have any financial support from Japan or from this country. So we had to support our life. Of course, we couldn't do begging. So we did have several odd jobs to support our life. 3 Japanese monks lived in the woods in the western Massachusetts, and we cut the trees and dig stumps and made green vegetable gardens and supported our life by doing odd jobs like picking blueberries or working for a potato farm for harvesting, or there was a tofu factory there. So we had a part-time job. We only worked few times days a week. We lived in a very poor life. I think our income, all 3 of us, was about $500 a month. That's how we lived. And we continued to practice and dzadzen and working on the land to make it a livable place. I spent life in that way until I became 30. That was my alternative way of life. I wanted to escape from the busy, noisy money-making machine. To me, Japanese society was one huge money-making machine, and school was a factory to produce the parts of that machine. And I escaped. And so I was really happy to live at Antaiji and live in Massachusetts in that way. So I lived in that way for about 10 years. What I was taught by my teacher was dzadzen, so-called Zen Buddhism, and that tradition in Japan started by Zen Master Dogen, or Dogen Zenji, and we call that tradition as Soto Zen. And the main point of Dogen's teaching was just sitting. We usually think this meditation practice is to attain some kind of enlightenment or awakening, but Dogen said we should just sit without any expectation, even enlightenment. Because we practice in order to get enlightenment, then that is desire. Desire or egocentric desire is still working there in search of truth. So from the very beginning, we just, in Dogen's expression, throw ourselves into the way without expecting any reward. That is what is called just sitting, or shikantaza in Dogen's teaching. My teacher's teacher, Sawaki Kodo Roshi, said, Zazen, this sitting meditation, is good for nothing. I always said, this is good for nothing. And that is what I recommend people, and it's really difficult to encourage people to practice this way because this is good for nothing. Zazen without expectation or without gaining mind, or Zazen good for nothing, is a kind of a koan. Because even when we started to practice, we have some expectation. I think almost always because we have some problem or some difficulty or some question, we start to practice. And so without expectation, at least to find some answer to question or exit from the problem I'm facing. So without expectation or goal, we cannot start to practice. Here is a kind of a conflict. We usually call this a way-seeking mind. And without this way-seeking mind, or in Buddhist term, bodhicitta, the mind which seeks awakening, or discover the truth. We cannot start to practice. But the teaching is you should not even expect the answer. So here is a conflict. When we continue to practice, this becomes really a serious question. And sometimes we have to face the dead end. That in my case, I reached that dead end after about 10 years after I became a monk. That means, I knew, Dasein is good for nothing. And I felt I was very fortunate to that teaching. That's why I started to practice in that style. So I thought I understood and I like it. Therefore, I devote my entire body and mind and time to this practice. But after 10 years, I found that was when I was in Massachusetts. We worked very hard physically. So when I became 30, my body was half broken. In my 20s, that was okay. But shortly after I became 30, my body was half broken. So, and I didn't have, income to have a treatment. So I had to return to Japan. So I couldn't practice in the way I did for 10 years. And I had a problem. I questioned, why is it a problem if Dzadzen is good for nothing? And I looked inside of me, and I found that, my understanding of Dzadzen is good for nothing is only understanding. But deep in my heart, I think, to practice good for nothing Dzadzen is the most authentic practice in Buddhist tradition. That's why I'm okay. That's why my life is meaningful. I really found in deep my mind, I had expectation, and I felt my expectation was filled because of good for nothing Dzadzen. And I had a problem when I went back to Japan. I couldn't do that anymore. And that is one thing that means that is good for nothing is only my intellectual understanding. So I devoted my entire body and mind based on my thinking. It's not really good for nothing. That is one thing I found. And another thing I found was from my childhood, I have been always good boy. When I became a teenager, I didn't like to be a good boy. To be a good boy, I think it's a difficult task. To be a good boy means I try to understand what the people around me expect from me, and I try to do the way they expect from me. So I felt that is not so honest way of life. First, I think other people's mind, and I try to follow their expectation. When I became a teenager and started to practice Zen, I felt I stopped being a good boy. I kind of betray all the expectation from my parents and teachers and Japanese society. So I felt I became a bad boy. But when I became 30, I found I was still a good boy. I wanted to be a good practitioner. I wanted to be a good disciple of my teacher, or I wanted to be better practitioner than others. I found it's not simply a Buddhist problem, but it's my psychological problem. That means when my body was broken and I couldn't practice, when I did in my 20s, so I couldn't be a good boy of my parents, and I couldn't be a good boy as a Buddhist priest. That's why, I felt my life was really good for nothing. And so that was kind of very shocking to me. And I was in the process of dealing with this for a few months. And at the time I lived in a small apartment by myself, so there's no sangha, and I didn't need to any practice as a priest. I was just me. One day I found myself sitting alone, not as a practitioner within the sangha, or not as a Buddhist priest, in a kind of a social occupation. I really sat myself, and I found deep peace there. That means I don't need to be a good boy. I can be just sit. And I found that is really Dzadzen that is